Welcome, everyone, to a brand new episode of the Jamsty Podcast, where we spin the jam. We're going to be talking about the newest album from Regina Spektor, Home, Before and After. And we're also, of course, going to be talking about, I've waited almost a year to say this, the new Porcupine Tree album closure continuation. This week on the channel, if you've been paying attention, which you should, you will note that we released our final record club that chronicles the 2000s releases of Porcupine Tree, capping it off with The Incident, which is the final album before this new one. So if you want to get caught up, go check out those videos. Go check out us covering The Incident. Good video on an under-discussed record. We also just put up the most recent episode in our Björk retrospective, covering also another really interesting record, Vulnicura, one that a lot of people like, one that also kind of gets a little bit under-discussed. So please go check that out if you haven't.
If you're watching on YouTube, I will make a point to put a link to all our whole playlist of Porcupine Tree videos right above my head right now. Should be there. Before we get started, a couple of things to shout out as well, the most important of which is that our very own August has released, I guess, 2 new EPs, or you could think of it as a double EP, a single double EP if you like. New music from Glacier, the ambient project.
Oh, yeah.
That if you've been watching us for any amount of time, you should probably be at least vaguely familiar with. Yeah, new double EP, Infinite Past, Infinite Future. That just dropped. It's available on Bandcamp. Go and stream, go and download, go and listen.
You can fucking get it on Bandcamp. You can listen to it on Apple Music, Spotify, wherever the hell you listen to your music. And if you're a cheap bastard at heart, it's free on YouTube as well, as is policy with our music.
Yeah, absolutely. I listened to it. I listened to both EPs back to back last night, which incidentally is the way I recommend experiencing them as a single kind of 40-minute experience.
Yes,
it's more great Glacier Flower, baby, and it is
Completely
it shows August and Mason continuing to. It's kind of funny to say this because it's part of the whole thing with this double EP is that it's constructed from sort of like sketches of older material that's been kind of updated and refurbished, and but despite that, it still sounds like the duo kind of like evolving further from even what they were doing on their last EP and making some stuff that's a little bit more out there and sort of avant-garde and texturally varied, I guess, than what we've had so far. There's a lot of stuff on it that feels like very much a throwback to, or at least like influenced by classic sort of 70s synthesizer heavy ambient, but there's also stuff on there that sounds like nothing I've really ever heard. There's like one track, I think the last track on Infinite Past kind of sounds almost like a warped indie rock song that's kind of just gone through a million filters. It's really creative. It's really cool. Go and check it out. As always, we like to kick our episodes off with a What We've Been Listening To segment where the four of us talk about records that we have been listening to in the last 7 days that we think are noteworthy in some fashion or another. Jake, what have you been listening to?
Golly, this has been a segment I've been looking forward to this week just because I've had a particularly great and somewhat interesting week of listening. First off, I get to say something that I've never really said before, which is I listened to a particularly beloved bootleg this week. I sort of have phases where I just, for a couple of days, I'll just listen to nothing but Slowdive. So I've always sort of meant to check out like the band's various side projects and just releases that are popular, I guess. And the one I listened to from Slowdive is a particular record called I Saw the Sun. And the interesting thing about this is that I didn't really know too much about the narrative of Slowdive as a band. And what this is ostensibly mixtures of various demos, B-sides, and just songs that didn't make it onto albums proper. Some of them are on the remastered version of Pygmalion, but basically it's songs that were recorded in between Souvlaki and Pygmalion, and even in some of those particular sessions. But basically, aside from a few nitpicks, great record. I enjoyed it like more than maybe I enjoyed it about as much as I enjoy, say, the Slowdive debut, which I think is their weakest album, but still a pretty great shoegaze record nonetheless. And the whole like, oh, Slowdive, it was a post-punk band. It's not exactly like that's not exactly a concession you have to make. That starts to become the band's sort of biggest strength and sort of their greatest weakness. They have incredibly beloved tracks on here, like I believe Morgan said this was his favorite Slowdive song. This release has Sleep on it, which has a staggering 3 million views on YouTube, which goes to show you how beloved this track is and how much people wanted to hear it on a release proper. And they also have the Brian Eno produced AB is on here. There's lots of really great material that I do wish was finished in the end, but it still led to us hearing a unique incarnation of this band, and I very much appreciate it. I had a great time listening to this multiple times this week. So if you're even a little bit interested, I can't say that it's going to hold up as a project for anybody else as much as it does me, but I think that this is as well put together as you could possibly hope for. And in terms of Slowdive stuff, is that they have a couple other side projects, like Monster Movies and the Pumpkin Fairies, but most notably, I think, their sort of alt-Americana side project, Mojave 3, which I finally listened to their first album, which is generally regarded as their best and most beloved, which is Ask Me Tomorrow. This album, honestly, it's why I'm not too upset about that mythical fourth Slowdive album not actually happening, because a lot of the influence of post-rock and psychedelic folk that you could hear burgeoning in their sound comes through on this release. And it does so spectacularly. This album is fucking credible. Right up there with Slowdive's like proper stuff. I would consider it to be go to bat with the best of them. And the cool thing is that the appeal of this band is very separate from Slowdive, even though the sound is very much in that kind of Pygmalion sort of, spacey, ghostly post-rock, but it does have like the twanginess of Americana, the kind of soulfulness. The thing that I was taken the most off guard by was the lyricism here, which is, I mean, this album is fucking heartbreaking. Like, I was thoroughly unprepared listening to this to go through it and just have my soul shattered multiple times when I was just, putting away groceries at my job, just having a good time, blah, blah, blah. And then you get to songs like fucking Where's the Love, or the closer, the incredibly bombastic Mercy. This is just a sensational album. And from what I can tell, the other Mojave 3 records, while not as beloved or even quite as acclaimed as this one, are still worth checking out. And I'm definitely going to after this, just because, in fact, if you really enjoyed the most recent Big Thief album, or one of those records that they released the year that they released 2 albums, this album probably going to appeal to you very strongly. It maybe doesn't have the variety, but it has a sort of cohesion that I think maybe Dragon Newer Mountain, love that album. Not very cohesive. That's kind of the appeal. This is more cohesive. It also might appeal to you if you like Sturgill Simpson, his really psychedelic stuff. I think that's probably in keeping with that too. And of course, you have Rachel Goswell from Slowdive singing. So I mean, there's sort of a baseline of how bad something can be when you have that.
But Mojave 3, I've heard a lot about. I feel like they are and were, particularly in their prime, like a reasonably popular band in their own right. I didn't realize the full extent of how basically all of the members of Mojave 3 are in Slowdive, more or less, at least most of them. So I didn't realize that connection to that extent, but that has me really, really intrigued, and I'm be very keen to check that out just to hear what that hybrid sounds like. Alt country was really in the 90s particularly had you had artists like Jason Molina of Songs Ohio and other artists like that who are doing really, really kind of underground cool things with like more deconstructed takes on country music. So I'd be curious to see how that sort of slots into that whole scene vibe.
Jason Molina is actually a great comparison. If you really like slowcore and stuff like that, right up your alley. This is great shit. And I am far from done with this particular record. Other than that, on the total opposite end of the musical energy spectrum, I listened to some weird shit this week. One of which the records is the second project I've heard from John Zorn. First, of course, being Spillane, which we've covered on this show, one of our most popular record clubs. I listened to my second album from John Zorn, The Crucible. Wow.
Brutal prog.
I was completely unaware of the fact that this featured a sort of infamous trio of musicians that became kind of notable within the John Zorn discography. The most prominent member of this trio, of course, being Mike fucking Patton. And
oh shit, look, Trevor Dunn's on this as well.
Yes. We have gone on about Mike Patton a lot on this show. We love Mike Patton. We've talked about Angel Dust. We've talked about the EP with Dillinger Escape Plan. We've talked about the self-titled. We talked about California. And let me just say this. This album is Mike Patton at his most unhinged. I don't think he speaks a word of cogent English on this album. The first song is literally...
You had my curiosity, but now you have my attention.
The first song is him freaking the fuck out. Like, I don't know what the mindset was of this, of just John Zorn went to the studio and was like, okay, I need you to lose your mind for like 7 minutes. And the mic was like, okay. And it's just him making hell demon noises for the whole time. And it rules. Like, the instrumental backbone of this is unsurprisingly pretty fucking great front to back. Just like everything instrumentally is super fun. If you really like modern shit like Black MIDI, I cannot stress enough how much this is going to appeal to you. And even then some, the jazziness is still more than present. There is a part on this album where there's somebody just fucking playing the shit out of a fucking trumpet. And Mike phonetically harmonizes with the trumpet, with his voice, making trumpet sounds as like onomatopoeic expressions. And it's so cool. This is an album that is, it is brain melting. And I use that in the both positive and negative terms, in that this is an album that brushes up against every tasteful sensibility one might have. And this might annoy the fuck out of you. For me, on the other hand, I found this ruthlessly compelling, utterly fascinating, cool from front to back. I'm not sure if it's something that I'm going to, happily revisit frequently, just because I really got to be in the mood for it. But I promise you, you will walk away from this bare minimum entertained. And on the note of weird shit, I listened to Scott Walker's album, Tilt. How do I even go about describing something like this? This is, from the first track, I was immediately arrested. Words cannot prepare you for what listening to this for the first time is like, because you're just like, oh, I'm expecting something weird and crazy, and then you get it and you're like, oh, not what I thought I was gonna get. This is definitely an album where you can see Scott Walker's roots as sort of a Baroque, like, folk inflected musician that also just becomes like dark ambient post-industrial experimental rock. Like there is no real solid classifier for this, but I can tell you this much: I really fucking enjoyed it. It's sort of Scott himself as a central presence, both like lyrically and vocally, is kind of enough to sort of tether you into this world of like purgatorial madness. It's not quite hellish. It's a bit too gloomy for that, but it's still something that's nonetheless utterly captivating. I want to listen to his other records purely out of curiosity, not even because I think like, oh, I like this, I'll like something else, just because I don't fucking know what his other albums are going to be like. I mean, for fuck's sake, he made a collaborative album with the fucking post-metal band Sun. Yeah. Like, fucking what?
So, interesting thing about Scott Walker, I'm very pleased by this development because I wouldn't have seen it coming, Jake. You're getting into Scott Walker, but also feels like the logical extension of your fascination with artists like Tom Waits, for instance. It's just like taking that to the next level. I actually think that for as astonishing as the trilogy of albums that he did in his late life, Tilt, The Drift, and Bish Bosh are, I think that his early records cannot be, the importance and the greatness of those albums actually cannot be overstated either, especially records like Scott 3 and Scott 4, like his early self-titled records, phenomenal. I think that Scott 4 is his best record, to be honest. I think it knocks everything else out of the park. But it is certainly true that the narrative of Scott Walker draws the people's attention, I think, more to his more recent records, which are incredibly unique and just harrowing listening experiences. I think my favorite of the three is The Drift, which is the second in the kind of informal trilogy of whacked out late career albums that he did. And The Drift is a hell of an experience. You have to do this trilogy of records and then double back to his early stuff, because the Drift is like, The Drift makes Tilt sound like, I don't want to say it makes it sound like quaint, but it does definitely level up on the weirdness. And there's like parts on that record where he's like slapping meat like for like minutes on end. And it feels like being in The Drift, feels like being inside of a fucking abattoir that's just suspended in outer space. That is what that record sounds like. It's fucking harrowing. And then Bish Bosh, which is his last album, which is like 2 hours long, is like the most extreme version of Scott that that record is absolutely fucking bananas. But yeah, Scott Walker, amazing artist. His early stuff, I think, I would definitely encourage you to go back to that at some point as well. Climate of Hunter, even the last record he made before going on hiatus, is really good too. He also did the score to Leos Carax's movie Polar X as well, which I love because that's such a crossover that makes so much sense, but also that I would never have predicted. God, what an awesome artist. I need to get back into him. I was so into his weird shit when I was a teenager, and then I haven't listened to him in like 8 years. So I need to revisit some of those records. All right, August, what have you been listening to?
All right. First, my assignment for the week.
Yes. Oh, forward to this more than I've been looking forward to talking about fucking Porcupine Tree, man.
So for context for our listeners at home, we recently had the Great Jams and Team Music quiz, and the outcome of that was that Jake emerged the victor and got to assign the rest of us each a discography to listen to and feedback on album by album each week. And so we're going to do that as a segment sort of at the start of each of our individual recaps of what we've been listening to. And so August can remind us of his assigned artist and the record that he listened to.
My assigned artist was the one, the only, the man, the myth, the used car salesman himself, TobyMac.
Return of the Mac.
This is his record Momentum, his debut album. The first thing that's interesting about Momentum is that it is a very distinct album from Welcome to Diverse City, because this is way more like Linkin Park, Rage Against the Machine, Eminem influenced than that album is. Like there are straight up some features that just sound like they're doing a faux like staccato, Eminem staccato. And some of these instrumentals, like on What's Going Down, you can so clearly hear the rap metal just oozing off of it. It's amazing. I gotta tell you about some of these songs, because this album, this is further revealing of the man TobyMac. We now know more about him than we knew in the past, far more than we ever needed to know. One, he wants to be black. This is an actual line on the album where
Yes.
he proclaims his wish to be an African American, but the uncomfortableness regarding black people in America only gets worse. Let's
Mac
analyze
Lemore,
what's
you are
going.
nothing.
The best way to describe this song is picture Right Now by Fort Minor on like ketamine, and that's what this song is. The first verse is about this kid named Mikey who's black, and all the white people hate him, but he's good at basketball, so they stop hating him and they put respect on the name.
Really makes you think.
Oh God,
You're not ready for this. You may not know it, but you're not ready for this second verse. You are not. I'm gonna read this verbatim. This is so bad. Now, welcome to the world of a girl named Susie. Susie's only crime was that she was born a cutie, physically abused by her uncle and her friends. Alcohol let them.
Stop.
This is I'm pretty sure
Let
this
them
is,
all
this
have-
is an Uncle Adams song. I'm pretty sure.
So yeah, this whole verse also ends with her and let 3 kids, 3 men, no daddies by 11th grade. Like Mikey got a raw deal here. He got a full ride scholarship because he was so good at basketball. Susie's stuck here in the 11th grade with 3 children. What's up with that?
God.
The album only gets better from here. Like on the song Somebody's Watching Me, which is of course about God's omnipotence and ever-presence. And the way they communicate this is by interpolating the hook of the songs Somebody's Watching Me. Like they straight up have an interpolation of the hook in the song's chorus. By the Rockwell song is, this album is like, this is brutal prog. Like, you want to know, this is what real brutal prog is like. Black Midi doesn't have shit on this album. This is insane. And
I
it's
didn't
like,
even listen to the album, and I feel like the blood leaving my body, like I've been cut open.
this isn't even the half of the full frontal assaults on this album. There's also tracks like Extreme Days, where Toby is just screaming at you, "These are extreme days." And that's like, that hook is repeated like 50 times with like reverb in the background. It feels, I can't communicate how oppressive this album feels. This is like insane.
I've listened to like the first couple songs along with August when he was hearing it, and I can confirm that the way this album is produced makes it sound like you're in the middle of a fucking hurricane. Like, I don't know what the fuck they did with this record, but it was before Pro Tools, so it doesn't have the weird sheen that Welcome to Diverse City has, and instead it just sounds like a Limp Bizkit album if it was like mixed by someone who had never listened to music before.
Oh yeah, fuck. I forgot that this album opens up with the same text-to-speech voice as Radiohead's Fitter Happier. Like, it's the same. And then there's an interlude where that text-to-speech voice has like a beat behind it and it's rapping. It's awesome.
That's innovative. I'll give him that.
I have to ask,
Okay.
first of all, Momentum or Welcome to Diverse City?
Welcome to Diverse City. I actually
Interesting.
listened to that again this week, and I'm honestly upping my rating for that album. because that's going to a 4 out of 10 just because like this is a different playing field. This is something new. This is a funnier character than we've ever had before. This is insane.
Only one album has Catch a Fire on it, so I mean,
Pepsi Daisy. Actually,
As
2 do,
someone
considering there's the
like-
remix album.
with like with someone who has a nostalgic tether to his early records, Momentum, Welcome to Diverse City, and Portable Sounds. It's
What a
always
fruity
kind of
ass
beguiled.
title.
Oh, they're all bad. It's always kind of mystified me that Momentum is the one that people are like, oh no, but like that's like the good one. Like all the other ones are just like not like this. That one's the one, and I'm just kind of like, I don't really like. Even if you're into this shit, I don't really think that holds up as well as some other shit. It's
I mean, Gone is like a legitimately pretty all right song, and I wouldn't say this has anything that gets close to Gone's level of quality. All right, hip hop. We've talked about some of it, talking about more of it. From, I guess at this point, legendary MC J Electronica. I listened to his debut EP, a singular song, however you will phrase it. Act 1, Eternal Sunshine, parentheses, The Pledge. And what's interesting about this on an instrumental front is that it is a drumless hip-hop project that samples the Eternal Sunshine of a Spotless Mind soundtrack and basically loops that as a instrumental flavor and kind of beat for the album. And that's really cool. I guess the big issue here is that it's 16 minutes long, and he's only rapping. The J Electronica is only rapping for like half of it, and it's a little disappointing for me because I think he has a pretty solid flow and some good lyricism, some really punchy lines and such here and there. And I mostly got into this because I was listening to some early singles of his, like Exhibit A and Exhibit C, which are
Exhibit
both
C is such a fucking
Yeah.
great song.
I love both of those.
The thing
Like,
about J Electronica is that all of the best shit that he's involved in does not appear on like any like album or EP.
any of his albums.
Well, he didn't put out
Yeah.
an album for the first time until 2020.
For 13 years of his career, he did not have a studio album.
But he is like, he's an artist that still is worth like kind of when he appears, like his rapping, I think is, sometimes he can be really good. A lot of the time he's like people forget he was on Control, right? The song with the Big Sean song with Kendrick and stuff. And he's been like the kind of like, fourth guy on the Posse Cut sort of rapper for a while, but he's a very, very talented producer. And
just listen to Exhibit A or C. Both of those beats are just crazy good.
Outstanding.
And this beat, pretty amazing too. I'm not even I recommend listening to this for the instrumental alone because it's really cool. It's a really clever use of that soundtrack. I mean, I would almost love to see him do more production work, just straight up production work, and I think that would be like amazing. Like a donut style project from him would be mind-blowing and cool.
Absolutely.
I'll move into some Brit pop, indie rock from the group Elastica. What's interesting about this group, first off, right off the bat, is that frontwoman Justine Frischmann was the girlfriend of, it was someone in Suede.
Yeah, he was Brett Anderson. And then she also went on to date Damon Albarn for 7 years.
Who is on this album. Let it be said. And this is a really solid piece of some of my favorite kind of indie rock, that being horny woman who just wants the whole world to fucking know and is loud and rambunctious. I know I shouted out the Long Blondes earlier. on this podcast. And I would definitely say if you're into that album, Someone to Drive You Home, give this a listen. It's a similar brand of just really energetic, exciting, just quick pop songs. Like this is 40 minutes, 16 tracks. That can be a little daunting for some listeners, but I think they're so good at just providing a simple, punchy riff with some fun lyrics, some pretty good array of instrumental palettes at that are really engrossing and immersive. So this gets a check it out from me. I'll wrap up my segment with a strange little curiosity from the magical mind of James Ferraro, one of my personal favorite progressive electronic ambient musicians. This is a record of his called Pixarny. This is a weird kind of curiosity of his from the 2010s. It's like 35 minutes and 2 tracks, and the first one, Unknown Visitors, is a really cool, like 20-minute long suite that just has this insane last 5 minutes. Like this record, I think, is listenable alone for that last like 6 minutes of that first song. I think the rest of the music surrounding it is a little passe. And this is the thing with James Ferraro. He's ridiculously hit or miss by virtue of him being ludicrously prolific over his like 15 years producing music. He's got 40 albums at this point. Whoa. And not all of those are going to be good. When he hits home on projects like 4 Easy Pieces for Minari, Night Dolls with Hairspray, and Farside Virtual, those records are phenomenal. Like some of my favorite records of all time are in his kind of top upper echelon of his career. But everything he listens to has this very like dreamy, hypnagogic feel that it's like a great kind of record to listen to later in the night. And I think that's really the only way you're going to get the true Ferraro experience, fucking half awake and listening to this album that you'll only half remember. Really clever, intuitive, interesting guy. I like a lot of his music. That's what I've been listening to.
All right, Morgan, last week you were assigned the discography of Gorguts by Jake. Have you had a chance to get started on that? And what are your thoughts so far?
Yeah, I listened to the first Gorguts album, Considered Dead. I think it's a great album, but I don't actually have much to report back about yet, because I feel like it's just a very strong sort of meat and potatoes death metal album with a handful of moments that betray how forward thinking the band would become in terms of the genre in which they inhabit.
There's scream bloody gore.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of
type
dissonance that you would come to expect from the band, even on their very next record. It's a very like you say, straightforward. It's not like a straightforward death metal album. It is like it has a certain like juice that makes it like a really, really, like I would say, a great death metal record. I think it's very underrated, actually. People don't talk about it. It's really strong, really solid. So tracks like Stiff and Cold, Disincarnated, the title track, Waste of Mortality, like there's just some Inoculated Life, the closer, is great too. Like there's just so many awesome songs on this, and it's a real showcase for some musicians who were some of the most notable in the scene at this time. You have James Murphy, who, not to be confused with the James Murphy of LCD Sound System, who was briefly in Death as well. I think he was on Spiritual Healing.
That would have been sick though.
Yes, you have Chris Barnes from Cannibal Corpse is on this record as well, and you also have this record being produced by Scott Burns too, who's a big sort of figure in the death metal world, and produced Leprosy and Sepultura's Beneath the Remains and a number of other sort of classic death metal and related records. So there's a lot of really, really good like not even really, really good, but great personnel on board here doing a really, really good job. It's just one of those records that I think is kind of so swallowed by the sheer insanity of what they would go on to do. So I'm actually glad in a lot of ways, Morgan, this is the first Gorguts album you've heard, because I think for a lot of people, it isn't the first one they hear.
Yeah, I'm glad of it too. I went into it with really no expectations at all, and I think that really helped it. Like it took me a while to fully get on the wavelength of Scream Bloody Gore the first time I heard it, because I had heard Symbolic and Sound of Perseverance quite a while before that. Once I did, it became like one of my most heavily spun death albums, and I could very easily see this inhabiting the same sort of space within this discography. I also listened to the new Coheed and Cambria album, Vaxis 2, A Window of the Waking Mind. Like every Coheed and Cambria album, really. If you're into the band, there are at least like 3 songs on here that will scratch whatever autistic itch in your brain that deeply connects with this band. Comatose is one of their best songs ever, I think. I've grown to really like Shoulders despite its questionable production. I think the song is just too unassailably good to really be hindered that much by the mix.
Agree.
And even some of the sounds on here that are newer for Coheed that you can find on something like A Disappearing Act, I really enjoyed. But it's just like, it's a long album. The ideas are not all that fleshed out in a way that makes me excited for the next album. But also, I would probably say it's my third least favorite of theirs, just in front of Year of the Black Rainbow, a record that is a real mixed bag for very similar reasons, funnily enough, and Color Before the Sun, which is just like, okay.
I listened to this as well, actually, and I have very similar thoughts to you, other than the fact that I think this is a really deflated second half. Like,
yeah,
there's 1 or 2 great songs hidden in there, but like,
yeah,
there's just a stretch near the end where it's like,
yeah, like Bad Man Through the Ladders of Supremacy, where it's just like, okay. But yeah, if you're a fan of the band, it's, you're probably already going to make a point to hear it. But yeah, it's worth a listen.
It's interesting. I've seen some fans online who say like this is like a really strong return to form and their best album in like X number of years or whatever. And I've seen maybe an equal number of other fans who say this is like unquestionably one of their worst records. So at the end,
Vaxis Act 1 is like so much stronger in my opinion. Like, I don't even think that album's like great or anything, but I think when you stack it next to this, it just undeniably comes out the victor. It's just front to back loaded with solid songs. It doesn't have any structural problems. It's just or production problems that this album occasionally has. It's just I don't get Coheed fans, man, and I am.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, is that Color Before the Sun not included. That has been the reception of every Coheed release since Year of the Black Rainbow. Is like half of the fan base is like, this is such a triumphant return to form, and the other half is like, what the fuck. So I mean, funnily enough, very similar to Star Wars fans in terms of reception of this band. Like, everybody can agree on like the first 3 or 4 albums, and then everything after that is like
So what I've been listening to in the last 7 days. Well, first of all, I will admit, as I have already admitted to you privately, but I will admit to whoever else is listening that I have been a very bad boy this week, and I haven't done my homework. And so, unlike August and Morgan, I cannot comment yet on the discography that I have been assigned, which is the discography of Muse. And to be fair, I've heard every Muse record before, but I want to do my due diligence and revisit all of them. So next week, this time next week in this segment, I will be talking about Showbiz and Origin of Symmetry together, and the first two Muse records, and that will be something I guess that you can look forward to. However, I do have other things that I listened to that I want to shout out this week. A couple of real strong highlights that I'm very much looking forward to talking about. First of all, I will talk about the new album from Lupe, Fiasco, Drill Music in Zion, a heavily awaited project from an artist who is certainly has carved out his own lane within the hip hop and hip hop adjacent world. Ever since 2006's Food and Liquor, an artist who I will be upfront and say I'm not terribly familiar with. This was actually my first time listening to a Lupe Fiasco record, and I have to say I really enjoyed it. It didn't bowl me over the way I was kind of hoping it would, and it seems to be being really glowingly received, although I did really, really enjoy it, and so I would like to revisit it to see if it grows on me some more. I suspect it probably will. But it's a really concise, really short, and really kind of effective record. There's some great songs on it, songs like Gotti, songs like Miss Mural, Naomi is a great song. The closer as well is excellent too. Really smooth, really excellently produced, as you would expect from Lupe. And yeah, I just think that this record deserves a shout out, and we'll hopefully get more out of it the more time I spend with it. And I'll be going back and listening to some of his previous records as well. So I listened to an acclaimed recent release from the dissonant death metal band Artificial Brain, their self-titled record, which came out early last month. And this was a very surprising experience. So I guess anyone who knows me particularly well might know, I'm a pretty big fan of tech death. I've gotten really into sort of technical death metal over the last year or so. And so I'm always intrigued and sort of expanding my horizons and seeing what bands are kind of on the cutting edge of that world and doing stuff that innovates and compositionally does things that are new and adventurous. And I think it's fair to say that Artificial Brain definitely fit that bill with this new record. It is absolutely one of the most creative death metal adjacent records that I think has come out in recent years. The compositional style here, the intensity of the playing, but also the just intricacy of it and the way in which it weaves dissonance into these really sort of, kind of almost paradoxically catchy progressions is really, really exciting and cool. It really ticks a lot of the boxes that you would expect from a dissonant death metal record. You have song titles that are like Embalmed with Magma, Insects and Android Eyes, which features Luke LeMay of Gorguts, incidentally, on that one.
That song is fucking incredible, by the way.
Yeah, Celestial Cyst, which was the big standout of this record for me as well, which I really, really loved. Glitch Cannon. So much great shit on this record. It really is, I think, a record that you kind of have to be in the bag with some of the more extreme forms of death metal to get into, because it has a lot of those extreme death metal sensibilities and trademarks turned up to 11. You have the vocals that sound like, Cookie Monster and like singing through a drain pipe. Really, really recommend this. This is definitely one of my favorite metal records of the year that I've heard so far. Really stood out to me, and is a nice, concise 45 minutes as well.
Yeah, it's solid shit. I listened to it as well.
And rounding up my recap of new releases that I listened to this week is I listened to a new album from the future garage sort of techno artist, The Range, who put out a new record called Mercury. This is an artist that I'm honestly I haven't always been all that into. I remember when his first album, Nonfiction, came out in 2013, got a bit of indie buzz. That record kind of just never really did anything for me. But I did really, really enjoy this new record. It's very paint by numbers in terms of like modern sounding slick techno. It uses a lot of textures that are, kind of tried and true. But I think that I found it to be the maximalism of this record and just the energy of it, I found to be quite compelling within that niche. And I really, really enjoyed this as a holistic project. I think that anyone who wants some sort of very friendly techno to listen to, that's got a lot of like catchy cut up vocal sample style things and just generally colorful atmospheres and textures and melodies, will really, really get a good amount out of this record. I would recommend it. Absolutely. It's a really, really strong entry from this artist. And it has a very what's interesting is it has a very kind of like vaporwave sort of cover art, and the record itself is like absolutely nothing to do with like vaporwave sonically. It's just, I guess, a cool aesthetic to have on your cover. It is a nice cover. I really like it. It's got that sort of Salvador Dali-esque energy. But anyway, album itself is quite good. I enjoyed it a good deal. All right, in terms of other things that I listened to this week, I definitely want to shout out a couple of big standouts. So first of all, on the recommendation of our mutual friend Connor, I got to my second album from legendary sort of emo by way of indie rock by way of alt country band the Weakerthans, and I listened to their album Left and Leaving, which is a fucking fantastic indie rock album. Like, this is Death Cab by way of sort of Jimmy Eat World sort of thing. Like it fuses that kind of brand of emo that is very like adjacent to indie rock, and just brings it really sort of together really well. It has that kind of nasality to the vocal performances that will remind you of bands like, well, actually kind of like, it sounds more like John Darnielle vocally than anyone else, but it has that very strong Death Cab aesthetic musically. The songwriting on this thing, though, and the one thing that any Weakerthans fan will tell you is the big attraction to their music, is how phenomenal a songwriter John K. Sampson is, the front man of this band. He writes incredibly well. In fact, I guess that's another good Mountain Goats comparison, is that not only does he sound like John Darnielle, he writes with the detail and intricacy and like the ability to kind of get you hooked in a story the way that John can. And the great thing about this record, I think even more so than the slightly more popular Reconstruction site, is that this record really refines and hones that. You have these great indie rock songs that are mostly all between like 4 and 5 minutes and just really make the most of that format. I would say that this is very much like a record for fans of like transatlanticism era Death Cab in particular. It really evokes that really, really strongly. There is one of the best songs that I've heard this year is on this record, which is the track Exiles Among You, which even if you don't have time to listen to this record, I would almost beg just about anyone to go out and seek this song out in particular. It made me bawl my eyes out, and it's just an incredibly emotional but also like really hard-hitting indie rock song that has a lot of grit and edge to it, and there's no shortage of other highlights on this thing as well. A great standout first listen this year for me, and I liked Reconstruction Site, their other album that everyone's sings the praises of, but I wasn't like fully head over heels with that record in the way that I wanted to be, in a way that I know that Connor and Saoirse are. But this record, Left It Leaving, I think is much more my speed. There's fewer tracks. The tracks themselves are longer and more fleshed out, and the sound is harder hitting and more aggressive. So I think that, in general, fans of all of the things that I've mentioned will get a lot out of this. And if you just like great songwriting in general, where the lyrics are really like as much effort is put into them as the muscular music itself, then Left and Leaving is an album that's definitely worth checking out. And the last thing I will shout out in my segment is the best thing that I listened to for the first time this week, and a record that just kind of, I put it on a whim because I was watching an interview with Stephen Wilson to prepare for our Porcupine Tree segment, and he mentioned in this interview, which is just very recent, that this is his favorite album of all time. So that's big fucking praise. And the record is Tangerine Dream's Zeit, which is one of their early masterpieces from 1972, this one. So it predates the records like Phaedra and Rubicon that I think are more widely heard, generally speaking. Zeit is a double album. It is just about 80 minutes of sprawling ambient music. Specifically, it is widely regarded as the first dark ambient album. It predates a lot of Brian Eno's innovations and those kinds of soundscapes, or like Hiroshi Yoshimura, whoever you want to name. It is really like, I don't want to say it's like the first big sort of significant ambient record, because I can't really say that. There was a lot of exciting and interesting stuff that was happening with synthesizers in the late 60s as well that probably would qualify. But Tangerine Dream, I think, are generally regarded as the biggest innovators in the ambient music world in terms of coming earliest, and also matching that with like the ability to create soundscapes that were sophisticated and sufficient enough to flesh out full albums and just exist in their own right. And Zeit absolutely knows what to do with its 80-minute runtime. this is a record that is, I want to say something that's going to probably sound a little bit pretentious to people who don't, I don't know, think about music in this way, but it's less music and more like an environment, if that makes any sense. Like you put this record on and it's like it's taking you to a specific place. And this is a 4-track album, and each of the tracks is like between 15 and 20 minutes, and you just get atmosphere for the entire runtime. And each track has a kind of atmosphere of its own that's related to the others, but definitely distinct enough to distinguish the pieces from each other. Weirdly, the comparison I thought of the most while listening to this was actually Miles Davis's In a Silent Way. I think that this record functions as ambient music in a very similar way to the most quiet sections of that record, and even something like He Loved Him Madly off of Get Up With It, or some of the really kind of experimental fusion stuff that Miles did in the 70s, where it was like just really kind of like moody and not particularly aggressive. But it's also that by way of Eno's Ambient 4 as well. Like if you really enjoy Ambient 4, the kind of swampy, kind of like eerie, like late night textures of that record, Tangerine Dream are essentially doing that here. It actually opens with the first piece on this record actually is a string drone, which I wasn't expecting. It like opens with this incredible sort of string drone that is eventually layered over with these synthetic textures that kind of build on it. And it becomes this utterly transportative listen. I have listened to this about 3 or 4 times this week. It's just a very easy record to put on at night while you're just doing something, whether it's like playing a video game or writing or just kind of fucking vibing out. And it has this great sense of like holistic progression where each track is kind of like more minimal and stripped back than the one before it, to the point where when you get to the last piece on the record, which is the title track, it's almost like it almost evaporates completely. And the whole album has this incredible sense of like, and just like I say, space and environment. And like if you listen to it in the dark, you close your eyes, you are taken to very colorful, and like it does a really great job for someone who doesn't have synesthesia. To me, it does a really great job of like creating a sensory experience while you're listening to it. And it's, yeah, I would even say that I think this is better than Phaedra or Rubicon, the 2 most lauded Tangerine Dream records, which is, you know, they're fantastic and really important. But Zeit really captivated me in a way that I wasn't expecting. It is slightly less friendly, I will say, than something like Phaedra, which has, I think, a kind of immediacy and a kind of, I guess, warmth to it that is going to be more attractive to what people are conventionally expecting from ambient music. Zeit is not a very warm record at all. It's a very kind of mechanical and cold and sort of icy album. And so if you're people who are looking for, you know, the pleasant ambient experience are maybe not going to enjoy it as much. But if you like the kind of ambient that just kind of takes you to another place and makes you kind of feel something entirely new, then you will enjoy this. The other comparison I would think of, not to keep on bringing up jazz fusion things, but I also thought of Herbie Hancock's Sextant while listening to this. If you stripped away all of the like, you know, intense kind of percussive stuff and just like focused on the synthesizers on that record, they're very much doing a similar thing there as to what Tangerine Dream do here. So yeah, I can't recommend this enough. This is absolutely one of the best first listens of the year for me. A very strong 9 out of 10 album. I could not get enough of it. And I can see why Steven Wilson loves it so much, because it's obviously nothing to do with prog in any way, but it is clearly it's had a profound impact on him as a producer, I would say, and the way that he approaches creating musical landscapes. And I guess maybe that's something that I'll come back to a little bit when we talk about the new Porcupine Tree album. But yeah, that's been my week. Phenomenal records that I highly
Steven
recommend.
Wilson remixed some of the songs on there for a re-release of the record.
Oh shit! Well, I have to check that out then, because that's,
I mean, naturally.
yeah.
Of
I didn't even
course.
know that.
Why wouldn't he?
Anyway, let's move into our first review of the day, which is going to be the new album from Regina Spektor. Home, Before, and After. Now, Regina Spektor is a Russian-born American singer-songwriter who has carved out her own unique niche within this realm alongside, I think she gets talked about a lot of the time alongside artists like Feist and these kind of individual sort of female singer-songwriter artists. Like Cat Power is another one I've seen her kind of compared to as well, who kind of exist within her own lane of kind of idiosyncratic musical visionaries and sort of songwriters. Another comparison I thought of was Amy Mann as well. She kind of has a bit of Amy Mann energy to her as well. The point being that she is a very idiosyncratic songwriter who you could listen to a Regina Spektor song and she might have a voice that sounds fairly commonplace, but you'll never mistake a Regina Spektor song for another artist once you understand who she is and how she writes. She is a very intriguing and interesting artist, and one that I'll say off the bat, I have struggled to get into quite a bit in the past. I've listened to individual songs from her in the past, and I recently listened to her most acclaimed record, 2005 Soviet Kitsch, which I'll say will probably grow on me. I feel like now that this new record, spoiler alert, has clicked for me, but that record I think held me at a bit of a distance to a certain extent. There's some fucking fantastic individual songs on that record, amazing songs, but as a whole I haven't quite had my moment yet with it. But I downloaded I had a moment last night though with this new record where it kind of started to click into place, and I downloaded all of Regina's albums in a kind of flurry, and I'll get to them I suppose. But anyway, suffice it to say, Regina is this big name artist who is well critically beloved, well regarded generally speaking, but also we've never talked about her because she's kind of a new deep dive for all of us. I think like we're all relatively new to Regina. I think I'm the only person here maybe who has heard another album of hers before listening to this one. So you're getting very much fresh off the presses takes about Regina's new record that aren't burdened by the weight of expectation, I suppose, or by the context of the stuff that she's done before. And this is a great album, I think. It is a record that has so much vibrancy and color. And again, I say idiosyncrasy. I try not to use the same words over and over again, but this is one of those records that okay, here's how I would describe Regina, and you can tell me whether you guys agree with this or not. The best way I can think of describing Regina is deceptively simple, in the sense that you listen to her music and it sounds like very straightforward singer-songwriter, often piano-based music. And then with a sort of second listen or with a little bit of additional focus, you start to hone in on things that are a little bit less conventional. And I'm not talking about like radical shit. I'm just talking about things like melodic progressions, the way a song will go, the choice of orchestration, her writing style and the kind of metaphors that she will use, the kind of things she'll write about, sly little things that she does to just kind of take you out of the convention a little bit.
Yeah, I would say I would agree with your points here. I think what really started to make parts of this record click for me was really analyzing, I guess, what I see as her kind of brand of humor she has on this album. Because I don't know, this album isn't like laugh out loud funny. It's like sly and witty in places. And I find that's the quality about her music that I found particularly appealing, where she'll like phrase something in a particular way where it's like evocative and kind of silly, and you're like, yeah, I get that. And that's without getting into specific examples, of course. That's more of an abstract, esoteric kind of view of how I look at her songwriting on here. And I would say certainly I think this album's I guess weirdness is a little more immediate than you might let on, especially with that kind of first 2-track sequence here where you've got Becoming All Alone, which goes into Up the Mountain, a song that sounds like no other song on this record, and then it kind of shifts back into the more standard mode of this record with One Man's Prayer. So you definitely get a sense of her kind of quirkiness, sense of humor, if you will, while just listening to this pretty passively. And I guess my appreciation for that kind of humor and sort of world building she had only grew with subsequent listens, where it's like, oh yeah, because there's a real connective DNA to a lot of this album. It feels very unified, is something I would say is a really big positive towards it. Becoming All Alone kind of that title functions as a bit of a thesis statement for a lot of the kind of lyrical musings on here. But yeah, that's what I would say in response to this sort of notion of her feeling very kind of deceptively simple. Yeah.
One of the things that I want to say off the bat, because I feel like if there's any Regina fans watching, they may be weary of us doing this. I don't want to restrict Regina too much by talking about her relative to other female singer-songwriters. I mean, I've already brought up Amy Mann, who I think is honestly the closest comparison I can think of. But I mean, most of the female singer-songwriters that we talk about and that we kind of lionize sing the praises of are female singer-songwriters that tend to write, and again, I don't want to reduce any of them in any way, but it tends to be like serious music, where there tends to be a kind of sort of intensity and a sort of like conscious, almost aggression to it that we are kind of drawn to, and that I think tends to get a lot of critical reception, so tends to get those artists pushed into our purview more quickly. Artists like Fiona Apple, Tori Amos, etc. And I think you could make a surface level comparison between Regina and someone like Fiona or Tori and not be off base. But the thing about Regina is, and the thing that separates her, and I think the thing that, after we talked about Fiona Apple just a couple of weeks ago on the Record Club, the thing that really made this satisfying and sort of stand apart for me is that Regina, and it's something that August that you've kind of alluded to with this sort of sense of humor thing, the way I would describe Regina is whimsical. Like she has sort of kind of devil-may-care attitude where you almost don't know whether to take her seriously because you're so conditioned by certain, conventions of the artistic singer-songwriter, right? So you're conditioned by that to expect from great songwriters this kind of very austere style. Whereas Regina is not an austere writer. She is a writer that is flowery. She's a writer that sometimes is just outright silly, including on moments on this record. Yet she carries through a certain level of conviction where you never get a sense, or maybe you do at some points to some people, but for me personally, you never get a sense that she is being whimsical for the sake of it, or whimsical purely to like in a way that feels like in a way that feels that it cheapens the music or makes it feel two-dimensional. She wields whimsy, I suppose, as a kind of tool to get you hooked into these songs that are not terribly complicated, but also like have these turns of phrase or like
it can catch you off guard, I think, really.
Becoming All Alone, for instance, I mean, the way this song is essentially like a song about, being super depressed and like imagining running into God and getting a beer with him.
Yeah. And then kind of facing down God with your problems. And he's just like, I don't know, man.
Yeah, what the fuck am I supposed to
and not having to pay for it because he's God.
Yeah.
I mean, and yeah, I think the whimsy that you mentioned is really, it's really a tool for distraction. It's kind of a misdirection, I feel. Not, you can kind of mistake the forest for the trees almost, is what I think.
Yeah.
That's definitely an interesting element of her songwriting, and I think a track like Space-Time Fairy Tale uses that to the greatest effect, where it takes this mundane, simplistic feeling idea, but she just elevates it to this really maximal height with that 9-minute runtime, the really lush orchestration that, while feeling familiar, also feels like really kind of bold and exciting. And that's a song where, I mean, just the 9-minute runtime, even though it's a little more uniform sonically and production wise with other tracks on here, that's a song that can really catch you off guard just for how sweeping and ambitious it feels on this record. It's a really magical kind of pretty moment, I would say.
Yeah, it is by some
Best
distance.
song on here.
Yeah, it's by some distance the longest song that Regina has released as well. And it's remarkable what a success it is. I agree, it's the best song on here. As the most sort of like, I think this is just proximity, but the effect of it and of the kind of feel of it across its runtime reminded me of the similarly lengthy Eye in the Wall off of the Perfume Genius album we reviewed last week. Both of those songs have very similar runtimes and use those runtimes to a similar effect to kind of like lull you into this rich landscape of texture and sounds. Of course, in Regina's case, again, she utilizes sort of flowery and kind of like almost sort of juvenile lyricism at certain points to really enhance an atmosphere. And that's the thing, like some songs will be about, we'll be telling these kind of nifty little stories or painting these kind of like little, I guess, tableaus. And then other songs will just be Regina using her voice, using rhythm and using repetition to kind of just create this intense atmosphere. I think Up the Mountain is a great example of that.
And one thing that I think is interesting, though, she comes from a bit of a vocal jazz background, and I mean, you can totally see it. She's just got this really sublime control of her voice that gives these tracks, even the calmer ones, a real kind of subtle forward momentum that even I think in the duller moments on this album keeps it flowing really nicely.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Then you have songs as well, like One Man's Prayer, which is another big standout on this record, I think, where Regina, this is like, I think the most sort of tongue-in-cheek. Well, it's got some competition, but it's one of the most sort of like, I guess, Ryley satirical songs on this record. It's essentially, ostensibly anyway, a song that Regina has written from the perspective of an incel. And it is essentially, well, at least that's the way I read it anyway. I suppose you might not necessarily read it that way. But I
wouldn't say I think that's explicitly how I would read it, because to me, I think looking at this record a little holistically, I think it works better as something that's a little more hard on sleeve and just like someone who's more down on their luck rather than just this full-blown like basement dweller. I think sure. Yeah, but that's at least, my counterpoint to that. I think
I think Regina leaves obviously enough again room for interpretation, but I like the way that again, this is the subversion of Regina that I love, is I like the way that it kind of starts out as, like you say, quite a heart on sleeve sort of song about someone who's opining to be loved and to have, as she says in a great turn of phrase, the deep love in my heart can't go to waste. It sort of starts as that kind of longing. And then eventually, like as the verses go on, the longing itself starts to get more kind of uncomfortable, or at least kind of like controlling. Like
and no doubt,
because like in verse 2 it's like, I want some girl to talk to me and tell me I'm different or say that I'm the same. I don't care what she thinks, just think of me. Lovely line. And then in verse 3 it's like, I want some girl to look my way and see that I'm better than the others, that I matter in her life. And then in verse 4 it's like, I want a girl beneath my feet to tell me I'm her king and beg me for a ring, and I want her to be afraid of me and think that I might
the ramping up of the desperation is definitely, that's a really kind of humorous part to the song that I do enjoy a fair bit. Beautiful melody to the song too, which kind of I think adds to that really great contrast between that hard on sleeveness of it and a little bit of the more like, this is a person who is just fucking losing their mind, which is ostensibly what it is. It's a really clever little song. It's one of my favorites on the album for sure.
Absolutely. Another highlight I'll shout out is Coin, which I think it's another one of the most, I guess, instrumentally kind of in your face songs on the record. It has some of the most vibrance. It's one of the songs where I think the production of John Congleton really shines. He's obviously one of the most reliable indie rock producers, and he is often recruited by artists who want to not necessarily bring an edge to the sound, but just kind of like, I suppose, more of a oomph to a kind of standard indie rock template. And I think that this is a song where what he's doing in terms of production is really gelling nicely with what Regina's doing. I think this is one of the songs where she kind of, you know, tells you a bit of a story and uses this kind of motif and an icon of the coin that, you know, travels through all of these different people and all of these different places, that to kind of like, I guess, teach some kind of lesson, or at least like reveal something about the way that we kind of float through life. It's kind of like the most sort of unusual and kind of like esoteric and really sort of original way of essentially just saying like money doesn't matter when you have, you know, love, like essentially is what the song boils down to. And but yet it doesn't feel trite or cheap like that sentiment would if someone just said it to you, because she just finds a way to frame it within this, you know, collage of different scenes and things that are happening, and the again recurring motif of the coin. And I just love this song so much in so many different ways. But yeah, anyway, I've kind of talked enough. I'd love to hear from Jake and Morgan now as well, for both of whom I believe this is their first Regina record. Correct me if I'm wrong. And what did you guys experience while listening to this essentially, and what do you guys think of what Regina does on here?
I've heard a handful of songs over the years. Never really made the commitment to finally sit down and listen to one of her records all the way through. And I think this is a really strong effort. It's tough to pick between the lyricism and the sound of this record as the, you know, the MVP, so to speak, because both are really strong, but I do find myself leaning even more towards just the sound of it in a lot of places. John Congleton always doing God's work, and that's no different here. Yeah, really enjoyed this.
Well, all of the highlights have pretty much been covered, so unfortunately I can only really talk about the things on the album that lurk a little bit less for me, I guess, even though I broadly feel the same way as everyone. Like, I promise viewers, listeners, I really like this album. It's just not going to sound like it because I don't want to be a repetitive, boring asshole. But I guess the hottest take I have on here is that I kind of hate the song Loveology. I find it endlessly annoying. It's insipid, and the melody is just, it's boring as hell, and I just kind of hate listening to it. I really think it just kind of comes, it's the penultimate track, and it just destroys the momentum of the two previous songs, which are the best things on here for my money. And then a really strong ending with Through a Door. And it's just like her kind of whimsical sort of fairy tale like presentation of the rest of the album feels like it works the least here, just because I don't feel like there's anything here, whereas with the rest of it I think it works well enough. I'm not that fond of Up the Mountain for kind of similar reasons, just because lyrically it's like, okay, like instrumentally it's cool, it's kind of interesting, it's a bit of a grower in that respect, but just like lyrically I just don't really get anything out of this, mainly because I think it stands in stark contrast to how fucking excellent shit like Space-Time Fairy Tale is. And hell, even the moments that are less like instrumentally grand or just sweeping, like the slightly irreverent but still very funny and quite enjoyable Sugar Man. I think that's a really funny song. It's just, you know, it's about sort of having a sugar daddy, but like in a way that feels way less tacky than that implies. I kind of enjoy that.
This song is so funny. I just want to like highlight some of the lyrics here. Like, yeah, again, like song about essentially leeching off of someone else, and like not like in a well, I suppose in a way that like says, you know, that's, if you can do that, like fucking go for it. Like, but the way that she kind of takes the sugar daddy thing and just kind of like explores all of the like possible ramifications of that term and the ways it can be used metaphorically. Like,
oh yeah,
the way she says, sometimes you need a little sugar to get through the years. They set a big table, didn't save you a seat. Just find a lap to sit on and you'll get something to eat.
All of that second verse, I think, is universally just some fantastic little clever turns of phrases, like the sugar rot your teeth, it'll make you high, but there's not a lot sugar can't buy. That's like, it's cute. I like it a ton. As always, I like the great little part in this song of her kind of just acknowledging, like, you can't mistake this kind of relationship for actually like something substantive. You have to get on with your life in a sense. I think that's an interesting little addendum to add to the song. I thought it was well needed.
Yeah.
But
There's
yeah,
always a little personal edge that she adds to these songs that I think keep them from feeling impersonal or disconnected, that always kind of anchors you into its grandest moments, but also its most simple. Songs like Raindrops, I think, are a great example of that. And Ryley already mentioned songs like Coin. The only thing is, I really think that like, there's also songs on here like What Might Have Been, which I also think is just a lyrically kind of insubstantial song that I just don't really get a lot from. It leads the listening experience of this album to be really messy feeling, because I will say this is a great record, pretty much like bordering on like incredible. It's just that it has too many like very distinct moments that take me out of it. It's just that all of those moments don't last a huge amount of time. That's like another reason why I don't like Loveology, because that's like more than 5 minutes long, whereas What Might Have Been is still like a scant 2-minute song, and Up the Mountain is still instrumentally compelling enough for me to, you know, go along with its vibe, but it feels structurally wonky as fuck.
that song, like the instrumental on that song, I find a little corny. It like reminds me of like an 80s like James Bond ripoff spy movie, like what that would use for its theme song.
Yeah, probably.
This is Dexter Nash in Up the Mountain.
I think I really dig the kitsch of that, but I can see now why it's been a little bit of a maybe less unified song in terms of what people think about it. One thing I'll say, I guess, if I were to summarize the most, I guess, divisive aspect of what Regina does, is that she utilizes repetition a lot, I think, in ways that personally I find quite creative and inspired, but also I think that if you're not super completely on her wavelength, can grate. I think Up the Mountain is a song that I love this song, but it definitely does hang on this kind of like not necessarily even lyrical repetition, although there is that sort of repeating the same motifs over and over again, but it's kind of like a rhythmic repetition in the way that she sings that could become stale, I suppose.
And I will say on that note, I know you guys have had positive words to say about this song, but I guess Coin is a song for me where that's especially true, where I'm just like, to me, that's a moment where the lyrical kind of repetitiveness of it just drives me up a wall in a way no other song on here does. And you know, it's a me problem, but for me
enough.
it's still a problem. So
yeah,
that's that.
And the motif of repetition comes up a lot on the album, like the hook of Sugar Man, their use in What Might Have Been of the Go Together refrain as well, which I like, but it's certainly, I think, you know, it's not a highlight of the record, but it is a song that I don't mind.
I mean, and I guess something you could say about the repetition though is a lot of this album deals with that kind of a lot of mundanity of everyday life and kind of what loneliness entails. So perhaps I bet there's some sort of thematic linkage between verbal and musical repetition and that kind of sort of day in, day out repetition. Which I wouldn't be surprised if that's a conscious choice on Regina's part. But, you know, as we've said, that can have very mixed results in the actual process of the music passing through your earwaves into your brain.
Yeah, I think.
Well, especially lyrically, like there's some like Up the Mountain or something like that. It's like she's like telling, like it's like a constructed fairy tale. And my problem with it isn't really the musical repetition. My problem is just that the story doesn't go anywhere. Like I just don't get anything out of it. That's like the thing that sort of like, that's what bites the repetition in the ass for me, is because I'm definitely on her wavelength. But the moments where the repetition bothers me is when it just doesn't yield anything.
That's fair. I think a lot of the songs, I read a lot of the songs on this record is kind of being meta songs about songwriting. I think Up the Mountain is definitely one of those.
Space-Time Fairy Tale.
Yeah, Space-Time Fairy Tale for sure. Up the Mountain as well. I think the way that she kind of talks about, you know, overcoming these trials and like things that she has to do and stuff very much feels like to me she's talking about the process of making art. And I think that carries across the record in a lot of ways as well. The relationship between, I guess, her personal inner emotional experiences and the way that she translates that into art. I think that is something that is a big focal point of the song Loveology, which I can completely understand not getting on with that song. I didn't like it the first time I heard it. I've come to enjoy it, but that's kind of just me. This happens to me a lot, is something that I don't quite get the first time. I will do a 180 on a lot of things just with time. But I really like I won't take away anything from what Jake said about the song. I can completely understand why it would bug someone, but I do really like the melodic choices here, particularly on the Incurable Humanist refrain, which I just love the way that is, utilized. I love the melody on that. But also, this is a song I think that is very much about like how Regina communicates through her art, or how like she communicates in general, I suppose, have the relationship between like her identity as a musician and songwriter and just like how she interacts with the people closest to her. And I think in that kind of Loveology refrain where she kind of like lists all of these different things, and ologies them, I think it's a nice little commentary on like how an artist or a songwriter, or even just like a music critic or whoever, can have this tendency to like intellectualize emotional things to try and understand them. And in a lot of ways that can kind of like make it less clear, or at least take you out of how much purer the experience is to just sing about nothing at all, or just, go to the movies or whatever. To intellectualize things is a natural human impulse, maybe, to kind of understand better, but also can kind of take away, I think, somewhat from the experience. And I think the song is a nice little commentary on that. And I think the record finishes really strong with Through a Door as well. Again, she's just great at crafting really nice melodies around her words. I think this song is a great example, especially when she says, "Home's where the light's on, no matter how long you've been gone," which is not like, a reinventing the wheel lyric, but the way she really sells it, I think, because in the hands of a lesser singer or songwriter, that kind of lyric could sound trite. But I think she just has this way of delivering that makes you feel the warmth in it. Like it feels a lot of the time like Regina is like giving you, not to rip on the Tribe Called Twist diss tweet, but like it's like Regina's giving you a lyrical hug.
I think you're really onto something there, though. I guess that's a good thesis statement for a lot of this record, that it's not fundamentally like reinventing the wheel in many, if any, ways on some tracks. It just feels nice.
Yeah, you get a wholesome feeling from it, and you feel satisfied at the end of it, like in a way that doesn't feel sort of like cheap either. It feels like genuine and fulsome. So
Does not feel kitschy.
A great surprise. And I'm really looking forward to going back to some of her earlier records. I have the distinct feeling that a record like Remember Us to Life or Fire, which have both been recommended to me, might be something that I glob onto even more, but we'll see what happens. Shall we do our favorite tracks and ratings then?
Well, my 3 favorite tracks on here are certainly Spacetime Fairy Tale, perfect song, probably one of the best songs of the year, frankly. Definitely Coin and Becoming All Alone, and least favorite by a mile, definitely Loveology, and I give the album a 7.
For me, favorites are going to be Becoming All Alone, One Man's Prayer, and Spacetime Fairy Tale. Least favorite would be Coin. Also gets a 7 out of 10 from me.
Yeah, I will say my 3 favorites are Becoming All Alone, Spacetime Fairy Tale, and One Man's Prayer. Least favorite, I'm actually gonna say Sugar Man, because I like the verses, and there's a lot of really clever lines in them. I hate the word daddy.
That's fair. That's absolutely fair.
Yeah, honestly.
It's objectively a terrible word.
Yeah, and like the way it's delivered on this song,
it's a word
just does not help.
It kind of halts the end of the melody, so I can certainly understand why that would grate on you even more there.
Kind of a word like moist, where it just doesn't. we shouldn't have done that. We should have negged that
Stopped
from the
as a
history.
species.
Yeah, and I will give this 7 as well.
I'll also say, I like the way that when she repeats Sugar Man, it kind of starts to sound like she's saying shook a man, like she's like picking like a man up and kind of like shaking him to like so the coins will just fall out or something, like a piggy bank or something.
Good woman who can shake a man.
So that's neat. I think my three favorite tracks are absolutely Space Time Fairy Tale. I'll also say One Man's Prayer and it's Coin and Becoming All Alone. I can't pick between them. Great stuff. My least favorite, and I don't dislike this song, it's just I think the most kind of unremarkable here for me is actually Raindrops, which is a good track, but I think one of the ones that stands out the least to me lyrically and just musically, it's pretty fine as well, but I don't dislike it at all. And I'm going to give this an 8. This has really grown on me over the week, and I feel confident calling it a really great album. That gives us an average overall of 7.3 for Regina Spektor's Home, Before and After. Now, the moment you've all been waiting for, unless you haven't been waiting for it, a review of the new album from Porcupine Tree.
Obviously, a big release here, big moment, at least for the members of this podcast, because we've all expressed our affinity for this band and its albums in the past. Like we mentioned at the start of the episode, we chronicled every release that they did in 2000s before they ended their run with The Incident, and that was the last we had heard from Porcupine Tree. And it wasn't exactly like they broke up or they just kind of stopped releasing music, as we kind of alluded to on that episode. They were definitely experiencing a bit of burnout because they were really prolific in that decade, but also the albums they were prolific with were these incredibly dense, incredibly high effort projects that were really well received, really put them on the map commercially, and were, definitely kind of big things to undergo. The band was actually sort of really earning a following in like Europe, and they were touring a lot there. That's where they were like recording all of their live albums. But Steven Wilson, he's always, had his hand in many different pots, so to speak. He had his solo career, which he started with Insurgents immediately after The Incident. And it just kind of seemed like he was musically drifting away from the limits of Porcupine Tree. You can sort of feel them kind of bursting at the seams on that last album. And I think that alludes to the fact that maybe everyone in the band was restless, but restless in a way that they maybe couldn't fit into a project under that particular name, because everybody always had their like side things. So, Steven Wilson did his own stuff, his own very prog rock, occasionally kind of progressive pop kind of stuff, very Peter Gabriel solo career, an analogy to that. And the sort of notion of a new Porcupine Tree album just kind of died. It was just like, well, the band's not together anymore and no one's really talking about it. So when the announcement came for it last year, I mean, it just really caught me off guard. I just never, it was just something that I never considered being in the cards. And the title of the album, Closure Continuation, is sort of a reference to the fact that this is kind of a watershed moment for the band in some respects, in that this is the album that's going to determine whether or not the band continues to do work, because obviously everyone is still an active musician, everyone is still working. Notably, the three members, Steven, not Colin. Colin is gone. Colin was the bassist of the band. He is the only not returning member of the original, like, complete lineup there at the end there. But Gavin Harrison is the drummer, and Richard Barbieri does the synthesizer stuff. And all of them have their own stuff to work with. But I think that the prospect of returning to something that's they're a little bit more confident in is promising. But I think the question on everyone's and my mind has sort of been, what does a Porcupine Tree album sound like in 2022? This is this is a band that's so anchored to their time in the musical sphere that it almost feels weird and anachronistic that they're like making records outside of that time period. And generally speaking, it's progressive rock. This is not a genre that is super in demand right now. It's not really cool or whatever. So there's not like, it's not like Steven went like, oh, if this album's good, we're going to keep making albums. It's more or less like this album cycle, them touring, they want to get a feel for everything. And if the reception is good and people like it and they want to do it, they're going to keep making albums. So in many respects, Glacier Continuation, it has an impossible fucking challenge in front of it. And that is, it has to appease former fans of the band that's gained a cult following that I would say is make this band at least a lot more popular than maybe it used to be, appease potential new listeners so that it does well enough for them to garner any kind of success, because they're not exactly insanely successful musicians. And it sort of has to appease critics of the band. It has to appease everyone. It's like music journalism is a completely different landscape now. And again, prog is not exactly in demand, especially not the kind of prog that Steven Wilson dabbles in. And when you're a dude who's known for being, you know, the guy who does the riffs on classic prog, even though I think we all agree that's a bit dismissive, everyone's the popular kind of thing to throw at him and his work is sort of like, you know, it's just it diminishes it a lot, I think, and it just sort of attacks Steven Wilson as an artist for not doing something that he was never interested in doing, and that's, you know, genuinely pushing forward progressive rock. Because there's this weird notion that if you're not actually like pushing at the boundaries of something, that it's like not good. It's just like automatically, and it's just like I find that mindset to be ridiculous, just because it's, if the artist isn't interested in doing that, then they aren't interested in doing that. And if you judge it by that merit, then that's a you problem, man. So in many respects, I expected this to be woefully underwhelming, just because I mean, think about it. The last album Steven worked on made our worst albums of the year list. We had a lot of animosity for that record. And, you know, just where that was taking thematically, you can kind of guess that like, oh, it's Steven leaning into a lot of his cringier sensibilities, and then just gets you real worried for his later stuff. So when the first single came out, Harridan, I was like, oh, okay, this is new. I mean, it's a weird, gnarly fucking song that starts out with like a jazz fusion bass line. It sounds very quintessential Porcupine Tree, but it also doesn't sound like it belongs on any of the albums that came before it. And I was like, perfect. This is what I want.
Not, it's like distinctly not a Colin Edwin riff.
Yeah, and Steven really, like, I'm pretty sure he emphasized the fact that he wrote all of the bass licks on here, and he did do, like, he does play the bass on the studio recordings, and they got someone to do it when they tour. So, like, there is a distinct, really, like, flavor here. It's like you have Gavin exercising some of his incredibly classic chops, and you have, I think, the standout on this album for me, which is Richard Barbieri's synthesizers, which on every fucking song sound better than I have ever heard a synthesizer sound. Like, every single texture on here sounds fucking incredible. Harridan, no exception. But basically, this single came out and it reassured me they've still got it. And they're doing it in a way that feels new to me. And the singles rolled in, and they released about half the album. They showed that it was going to have 3 bonus tracks, but the album itself, the core of it, is 7 tracks. And if you're familiar with their previous work, that's not exactly a huge standout, just because something like Fear of a Blank Planet is a 50-minute album that doesn't have that many tracks on it. So for me, that was reassuring, because it was like, okay, this is going to be a focused effort. This is going to be something they put a lot of like attention into these songs. And honestly, this sounds silly coming from me, just because it's probably the most expected thing ever. Like, oh, Jake likes a Porcupine Tree album. But like, this is the fucking best case scenario I could have possibly hoped for, in that Glacier Continuation is being received well. Porcupine Tree Reddit I've been keeping up with, they love the album. General reception for it has been pretty strong. I think the general consensus is sort of not as good as the 2000s records, but then again, what is? And pretty damn close. And also, it's just an insanely tight experience. This is an all killer, no filler record that contains some really mature compositions for this band that also really leans into the alternative metal side of their sound that I was kind of sure they were going to abandon or shed at some point, and they really haven't. This is an album that is aggressive and emotional and like just really full of patently emotional content, and I'm just fucking thrilled about that. If there's one thing that bugs me about this whole rigmarole, it's that first of all, the album's charting. Like, this album's doing really well, which thank God. I'm really happy for the band, and they seem to be really grateful. They're really proud of their work, and I think they should be. There's a lot of evident talent going into the thing here, but the one thing that's been killing me and has been really making me look forward to this segment is the fact that, man, I can't fucking stand the way people talk about progressive music in current day. It's like people are talking about this like they're grading math homework. They're just like, oh, this thing here is like, it's an extension. This is a progress. It's all purely quantitative evaluation that feels so cold and weird to me that it's just like, you can talk about the constructions of songs here. I think that's not unfair, but it's like, it just feels like people are tapping into like 30% of what this band actually has to offer. And I know, based on our previous discussions of albums, that we can take a crack at this kind of stuff and look at this from a more purely holistic point of view.
Yeah.
And I don't want to spearhead the discussion here. Like a lot of times, we have a band that's associated with one of us that, and like we can get really riled up and really enthusiastic about how much we love something. And rest assured, I think Closure Continuation is fucking fantastic. I don't want to take up all the time here. I'm just going to start the discussion with what I think of the second single and probably my favorite song on here right now, which is the second song of The New Day. A single that very much underwhelmed me when it came out. Like, I listened to this and I was just like, this is a decent Porcupine Tree ballad. It's okay. It's good. I like it. I will like it on the album, I'm sure. But it just didn't do a whole lot for me. In the coming months, since it's been out for a while now, this song is a salve. I love this thing. Right after Harridan, I think that this is a brilliant sequencing choice, just because that's a really like active, really aggro, menacing song. And then you kind of have to bounce back with something that's a little bit more comparatively peeled back. And it's just a song that's very much about like this whole album. I feel like it's very meta in the sense that the whole Closure Continuation kind of makes it feel like that watershed moment. It's really using that as a part of its theme, in that it's very forward looking, but also obsessed with the past, in that it's simultaneously caught in a dichotomy, and it's exploring what it's like to feel like you are caught in between those two places. And that's what Of the New Day is really about. Just like being on the verge of something else that isn't quite here yet. And as someone who's in a very transitional period in their life right now, and just a song that sounds as beautiful as this has been something I've come back to over and over and over again before the album was even out. In the context of the record, I think it's even better. It's just some of the best work I think these guys have ever done from an emotional standpoint. And the solo here is just spectacular stuff. It's really measured in the way you'd want something like this to be. Its solo is gnarly as fuck for a song that's as quiet and comforting as this is. But it's still something that nonetheless, every time I come back to it, it really just reminds me of why I love this band so much, is that for all of their instrumental proficiency, for all of their skill, the emotionality they harness is second to none. And it's unique to boot, just because nobody sounds like this, and nobody sounds like this in the way that it sounds like this. So that's probably my favorite moments on the record, and I am very curious, of course, as to hear what everyone else thinks and what some other moments on the album stand out to you are.
I want to pick up on something you said and just have a little bit of a discussion about, like, because you said like one of the reasons you were looking forward to this is because so much of the discourse surrounding modern prog is nigh on unbearable, and just the way it's talked about is kind of, you know, just terrible, frankly. And I've been thinking about this week, because this week is also the week that the new Black Midi album leaked, Hellfire, which, you know, spoiler alert, a number of us here have listened to, and I think we all uniformly love that album. We will wait until it's released proper to get into any more detail. But what's interesting is to compare the discourse around a record like that compared to the discourse around a record like this. And I think you can, there's a lot of interesting takeaways. And I want to, you know, I preface this with the fact that we've listened to the new Black Midi record and we all love it, because I don't want to say any of the next stuff to denigrate it in any way, or to denigrate Black Midi in any way, who are enjoying a moment culturally right now that they thoroughly deserve. But it is interesting to think about the way in which different forms of prog are talked about, because for the longest time growing up, like for me, prog was not fashionable. Prog hasn't been fashionable for, I don't know, since the 70s, really. Like,
prog wasn't fashionable when Porcupine Tree were in their heyday.
No, exactly. That's really interesting. Like, and you think about that era where, like, you think about popular music media and how it was responding to prog bands like Porcupine Tree or, you know, Tool, for like, I know they're not the most ideal comparison, but they are one of the biggest bands adjacent to this.
Not unfair.
Or like even the Mars Volta, for instance. You know, bands like for the longest time, as a kind of, I guess, reaction to how huge prog was, like there was this massive backlash against it as like tasteless indulgence, I guess. It's all very, you know, technically proficient and impressive and beautiful and all this sort of thing, but it is, you know, for a lot of people, or at least the critical discourse was that it was too, you know, wanky or too excessive or too, I guess, indulgent in a lot of ways, and, you know, whatever. But what's interesting is that I think prog is having a resurgence in popularity and even coolness in the last couple of years. And Black Midi, I think, are emblematic of that in a lot of ways. And it's really interesting to me because a lot of, you know, what's cool and what's fashionable musically comes in like generational cycles. Like there's a famous, I can't remember who it was, but a great music writer wrote about how there's like a 20-year cycle to a lot of popularity of things where, you know, 20 years after something kind of fades away, it'll start having a resurgence in popular culture again.
Perhaps a similar theory being the Strauss-Howe generational theory, which deals in more of a centennial mindset, but also uses 20 years as an integer to distinguish trends and more broadly societal context than a pop culture context, but relevant to what we're talking about here.
And I guess you could say with Porcupine Tree and Tool, like having their moment of popularity most strongly in the late 90s, early 2000s, that was kind of representing somewhat of a 20-year cycle from the kind of fading of prog in the late 70s. And maybe this is another 20-year cycle from that, who knows? But anyway, to get to the point, prog is having a resurgent in popularity, but it's specifically and interestingly a specific form of prog. And it is this prog that is incredibly technical, incredibly kind of blistering, incredibly overwhelming, but also it is prog that is made by young people. And what's interesting is that the prog resurgence is very much happening with Zoomers, with Gen Z people, with really young people who are getting into really young bands, who are, you know, taking so much from not even just prog reference points, but like, you know, stuff that's adjacent to prog, like, I don't know, This Heat or Primus or whatever, like really avant-garde stuff. And that is kind of what is the moment at the moment, I guess. So as a result of that, prog, which is, I guess, by comparison, conservative, musically speaking anyway, which I think that Porcupine Tree is in comparison, unarguably in comparison to some of these big bands that are, you know, really popular at the moment, like Black Midi. It has this strange end result of feeling quaint by comparison, and almost, I think, having more in common with classic rock than prog at all. I think nowadays what Porcupine Tree are doing is not, all that far removed culturally from what like legacy classic rock bands do at this point in their careers. Like, I don't know, I can't even think of a good comparison, but to me, in terms of like what the cultural idea of what prog is now, Porcupine Tree are like further from that and closer to like what the cultural idea of classic rock is now. And anyway, all of this is to say that people have certain expectations now and certain ideas of what progressive music is in the 2020s now. And Porcupine Tree just don't fit in with that at all. Porcupine Tree are more akin to, like I say, classic rock, or even like at certain points, like harder edged, dreamy kind of space rock sort of stuff. Maybe even like post rock, weirdly enough. Like they might have even more in common with that than like progressive rock. I don't know. And I don't want to get too wound up in genres. But anyway, I think that a lot of what people, I guess, talk about in relation to this is how it does or doesn't conform to the idea of what a certain aesthetic and style of music should sound like at a certain point in time. And, what's interesting about it is that this is 100% a for the fans record. Like, I 100% believe they made this record the way they wanted to make it, as their creative expression, but also like it's not a record that breaks any new ground for Porcupine Tree. And we kind of are living in an era where the extent to which you are heralded in some respects is related to or adjacent to, I guess, the extent to which you reinvent yourself, or the extent to which you continue to display some kind of dynamism. And that, I think, is accentuated in the world of prog, where, the more eccentric, the more batshit, the more, abstract it is, the more, engaging and interesting it is. So when you have a band that are doing, reasonably straightforward, again, within this template, forms of prog music, and they're revisiting a form that is very much akin to records they've made in the 2000s, like Dead Wing or In Absentia, people are less receptive to that. And, with the exception of fans who are going to be delighted, of course, to hear new music that brings that energy back, that brings that vibe back, that takes you back to the feeling of listening to those records. And so I guess your mileage with this is going to vary depending on how much you want that from Porcupine Tree. And so I think a lot of the discourse around this record has been swallowed up so much by what people want from Porcupine Tree, and less about what Porcupine Tree are good at doing, what Porcupine Tree bring to the table, what Porcupine Tree actually deliver. And it's all getting kind of swallowed by this weird tangential stuff. And I think the reason why the record has so little appeal, I guess, to people who aren't super big fans of Porcupine Tree is that it's kind of aimed at an older audience as well. It's kind of aimed at an audience who understands that, for them, bands are at their best when they know what they do well and they stick to it. And they don't like try to do something that is, out of the wall for them. Like when a band, especially when you've got a comeback record after a fucking 13-year gap, you don't want a band to come back after that level of time and do something completely unlike what they've done before. You want a band to come back after that amount of time and be able to confidently reassert themselves. And I think a big part of what this record is, as you've kind of touched on, Jake, is it is kind of like Porcupine Tree reasserting themselves, as Porcupine Tree saying, we have the same energy we had all that time ago, and we can deliver that. And we're back, essentially. And I fully expect that if they do another record, it will be somewhat of a departure from this, purely because this is the reassertion that I think a comeback record needs to be. All the best comeback records are records that make you feel like, oh yeah, this is why I love them. They've still got it. They've still got that thing. And I think that a comeback record shouldn't be, personally, a comeback record shouldn't be put down for doing that, for not innovating or presenting a new vision of the band. Because a lot of the time what you want is to be reassured that the band can still do what you want from them. And that is what Porcupine Tree do in spades here, in my opinion, at least.
I think that should be at the forefront of what people think about and talk about, and the way they like understand this album is that first and foremost, this does have to prove to the previous fans of the band that they hold that same appeal. And as far as I'm concerned, that should always be front and center what a band should be focused on doing when they're undertaking an endeavor like this. And a lot of people fail to consider that. But what I think in terms of what Porcupine Tree are right now, blah, 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 want to move past this, but we live in a world that is very demanding of immediacy, which is what I think a lot of what you were talking about is summed up as, is that, like, you know, bands like Black Midi are really popular because they are obviously proficient and obviously overwhelming and unique, and it's arresting to people. And so on the opposite end here, I feel like we get to a point in musical discourse and music culture where genre doesn't matter anymore. People are blending genres and weaving them together or bringing them back, or like it's to a point where music and streaming and the ubiquitousness of music and culture and art, it doesn't matter anymore. In terms of, like, it's easy to use to classify for the sake of our brains and for the sake of people who want to organize movements and chart how things work. But the idea of genre has been dead for years, really. And the people that say this and evaluate things like this don't ever take this into consideration when it's music that they don't think is hip and cool.
Also, like, we live in a kind of musical culture right now where people are so used to the saturation of music taken to its extreme and genre blending taken to its extreme. So if that's all you're listening to, if that's all you're immersing yourself in, of course, a record that is a relatively straightforward take on a single genre is going to sound underwhelming by comparison. That is just because that's just the nature of, you know, the floor being the standard being raised. And so that's, I think, one big reason why perhaps a record like this, I don't want to say necessarily it's being unfairly evaluated, because it's valid if you don't love it. But I do think that the environment that we're living in at the moment musically, in terms of the alternative music world anyway, is one in which this record is not going to appeal to a lot of people. And that's something that I guess people should be aware of, I suppose. I don't know.
To get back on track here to the album, I think it's a testament to what Porcupine Tree are doing, that we're talking about this and making these concessions and excuses like people don't like this album. This is in the top 50 of Rate Your Music for this year. Like, from all accounts, this album is a resounding success. It's really more in the circles that we inhabit and that we stick to in music journalism and criticism that this is more applicable. So it's relevant, definitely, but it's also the fact that I think Porcupine Tree have, like, you don't need to ride that excuse to think that this is a good album. Not at all, I think. What is done here, I think, is a sort of maturation of their sound. It's a concise record, but it also embodies a lot of the things that they did well in a way that I wouldn't necessarily say that they've done exactly before. Most of the songs here, I'd say a solid half of them, if you put them on old Porcupine Tree records, they wouldn't work. They wouldn't gel with the rest of what the band is doing, whether or not they're leaning more into alternative metal or the harder parts of their sound or the more atmospheric stuff. Some of the stuff on here definitely could, because some of the stuff here is older material that they have brought back and made more cohesive. But I think it's a solid, like, half and half. Like, stuff like Harridan or even Rat's Return or maybe Chimera's Wreck, there are songs I really just can't see being on old Porcupine Tree albums. And it's not because they're a new genre or anything, but it's because they're a sound and a tone that the band hasn't really worked at before. There's a maturity to some of the songs on here, like Dignity, for example, which I think is very in keeping with Of the New Day, which kind of harkens back to old sounds in terms of the fact that I think the guitar tones on a song like Dignity are, like, super Rush inspired. Like, this is so like, right, it's like 70s golden era Rush. But the tone here is so warped and sad, but, like, with a weird undercurrent of hope and optimism that this band really hasn't had in a while, since like Lightbulb Sun probably, which in many ways is a comparable record to this. It's just a little bit more structurally tight, I suppose. But I don't want to keep harping on it, is that I know Morgan is a really big fan of the album, like me. And I want to know from another person whose love of Porcupine Tree is at least comparable to my own, what the fuck about this stands out to you the most?
Yeah, I think generally speaking, if I could put it as concisely as possible, it does what the best comeback albums do, in the sense that it sounds like you're right at home with a band that you love.
Yep.
But also that the time that has passed has actually affected the musicians in some way. To perhaps belabor the Tool comparison, this is everything that Fear Inoculum isn't, in the sense that that record is the same shit that Tool have been doing since Undertow.
Arguably a regressive album, I would even say.
Well, the point is, I feel like this and Fear Inoculum are sort of like polar opposites out of what I want from the respective bands. Whereas this rides this really difficult line of familiarity and refreshing. I mean, naturally, the musicianship on display here is what you come to expect from Porcupine Tree. I will say, I think, as much as I was hoping it wouldn't, I think Colin Edwin's presence is missed here in a pretty significant way. I think the bass line Aridin is really the only standout for the instrument on the album, and the rest is, far from like incompetent or anything, but it never adds anything, for lack of a better word, maybe authorial, in the way that Colin Edwin's always did. Like, there's a great, noticeable, easily identifiable Colin Edwin bass lick on basically every Porcupine Tree song that he plays on, and I do
Deadwing especially.
But that's really the only big demerit I can throw at the album, because I think everything here is, it feels like the three remaining members have sort of grown really comfortable in the years that have passed since the incident, which is an album that feels distinctly uncomfortable, which is both, as we discussed, a positive and a negative for that album. But this, especially for a band that's been gone for 11 years now, this feels distinctly like they've put on an old pair of shoes but walked a new road with those shoes on. Strange analogies.
Well, yeah, like we said in our incident review, that the thing about that record, maybe the biggest detraction could be summed up in the fact that the band sounded a little bit burnt out. And because of the run they'd had, and they weren't able to kind of fully realize the vision they wanted with that record. Whereas one thing that really strikes me every time I listen to Closure Continuation is how, refined and urgent and clearly urgent every minute of music sounds on this record. Like, all of these songs are so, they're clearly so labored over, and they're clearly so like, I believe that part of the backstory for this is that they've been working on these songs sort of off and on for years, I think, like kind of tinkering
Half
away.
of them are like a decade old.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Harridan's like a 10-year-old riff.
Yeah, so you can see the level, I guess, meticulous detail and composition that's gone into these tracks. I think definitely the tracks like that stand out to me the most, tracks like Harridan, tracks like Chimera's Wreck, tracks like Herd Culling. I think those are massive songs that have beautifully intricate riffs and interplay, and really, really from moment to moment feel as though you're getting really great and really colorful and awesome ideas kind of really just kind of being thrown at you. I think Harridan is absolutely the best thing here for me because it best exemplifies this. Like there's so many different musical ideas in Harridan, and yet it's actually kind of a fairly simple track for like a longer, more bombastic Porcupine Tree song. It has these kind of regular refrains that it returns to. It has these kind of simple stationary elements, but it just flits between them in ways that feel really, really, really satisfying. And also, like, this kind of goes without saying with Steven Wilson, but I feel the need to emphasize it. This is immaculately produced. I mean, obviously it's going to be, but like I was really struck by how clearly Steven Wilson's experience producing, mixing, remastering all of these different records over the last 10, 15 years has helped him to refine his skill in that regard, because this might be, you know, if not the best sounding or the best produced, at least like as good as the best produced. And on that, in terms of that anyway, like there's no production on any other record of Porcupine Trees that I would put above this. It is really stunning, and especially with properly good headphones and properly in like lossless files as well. This thing absolutely beats and vibrates and just kicks your door in. Like, I think one of the most awe-inspiring musical moments of the year, I guess technically last year, since that was when the song came out, but like that moment in Harridan where that fucking dirty ass riff, like about halfway through, just kind of kicks in, and you're just like, fuck me. It's like, what? Shit is amazing.
It helps too that I think that there is a load of structural dynamism to these songs that really let you enjoy how great they sound in a really multifaceted way. Like, I've heard people like on the Porcupine Tree subreddit are just like, man, Harridan and Herd Culling are the best Opeth songs in the last 10 years. And part of me is kind of like, yeah.
I mean,
if Opeth are going to do prog rock and just ditch the metal, they could do worse than to try and make something that sounds like this.
This and the last Opeth album have a decent amount in common, but the thing about this that I like more is that I think the production is a little better, is that all of the instrumental ideas are a little bit more tangible and felt here. There's a bit of I almost think the new Opeth album is a bit too clean, whereas this just, it really knows what to make, kind of, you know, like that dirty bass line and shit. It's just like, it knows how to mix and master everything properly, so that all of it sounds like it hits. And you talked about that moment on Harridan where it really just stands out to you as like, oh, it's a really like blood pumping moment. All of these songs are designed so they have at least one moment where you're like, whoa. For example, Dignity, again, is a song I brought up before. Like, when the really, like, the brief but like absolutely spellbinding chorus comes in on that one, and it's like the moment where it's like where it mentions the main character of the song staring into the sun, and the fucking synthesizers swell here, and it literally makes you feel like you are staring at sunlight directly without actually having to do it. And it's mind-meltingly good. And there's the fucking, I'm never, ever going to get tired of Steven Wilson's scream of on fucking Herd Culling. That song has grown on me exponentially, in that I just think it is so hard. It's a song that like simmers with this like Fear of a Blank Planet era paranoia, which I think is a really big theme of the album. Like Walk the Plank, Herd Culling, and Rat's Return to an extent all have a very like simmering anxiety to them that feels really drenched in what they're writing about, which I want to emphasize here is that I think genuinely and wholeheartedly, I think this is one of the best written Porcupine Tree albums, full stop. And which I did not expect, especially because The Future Bites was last year. And that was the thing I was the most worried about. I was just like, with Brexit and the state of the modern world, I just feel like this album is just going to be so up its own ass with all of the shit. And Steven's not going to do it well, because I just know he won't. And instead, he harnesses what this band are best at talking about, and they're talking about the emotions that it creates in people. They're harnessing the feelings that all of us are feeling right now, and that this feels really contemporary and bizarrely kind of political, but not because it talks about Boris Johnson, even though there is a part where there are dictators references on Rat's Return, where you hear Stephen Wilson in the background go Pinochet, which is just really funny. But as long as it's not a modern
Kim Jong-un.
It's unironically think that slaps like a motherfucker.
No, I like that part.
But,
it's so fucking like ridiculous,
weird,
and excessive.
Yeah, I mean, and it's like, well, and Rat's Return too is like there's getting it like this album is certainly, if it has like a really tangible theme outside of its really like personal stuff, it's definitely like men in power abusing their power, and the sort of like the mentality of the sort of like Walk the Plank is, first of all, I think probably inarguably, I've seen the Rate Your Music scores for it, this is probably the low point on the album, definitely is for me, even though I really, really like this song. It serves as a decent interstitial moments between two of the album's best moments. And for me anyway, it just really gets at that simmering anxiety and feels really, really cathartic, just because you see it's like all of the people who are on this, you know, the lyricism wise, like all of the people who are on this sinking ship and responsible for that ship sinking, having to suffer the consequences of drowning, basically. And right now, I can't tell you how good it feels to listen to a song like that, considering recent world events that have happened. Well, so, you know,
like, here's the thing, right, is that you're 100% right. I think Stephen Wilson, I mean, maybe not obviously, but pretty clearly is writing about the same sorts of like modern political issues and like, you know, commentary on, you know, the sort of shit that he's been writing about for a while. The difference is the way he's writing about it is more fitting to his musical strengths as well. And like, because I think that a song like Herd Culling is probably like, I read that as very much being a song about mob mentality, whether it's in the online space or in literal real life spaces.
Of the everything on fucking A Fever Dream,
Ivory Tower.
Yeah, sort of. It's to me, it's about a song about like a conservative family like getting in their house, and like they're so paranoid by all the things that are, you know, outside, that they're all know, that they hate, essentially, that they, you know, they say like, son, go fetch the rifle now, and it's just they're so paranoid that it becomes this like hive of festering like hatred. And well,
it's obviously written from an English perspective, but for me, it really feels like the poor families that only consume Fox News and just don't really have a particularly well rounded view of the world around them, and they're just fed and inundated all day with things that they are supposed to be afraid of, and eventually it just results in this like brain melting levels of almost like mass delusion, when like nobody's making the frogs gay.
It manifests in that like primal rage scream on that song, which is followed up by one of the sickest riffs on the album, and may I just say, the riffs and like hooks instrumentally on this album, oh my god, they're fantastic. I have been like the melody and for the chorus of Rat's Return has been stuck in my head for like a week and a half. Like I will literally just be walking around and just be like, and just be like, ah, shit, fuck. And then I have to listen to the album because I'm just like, ah, god, so catchy. There are moments where you're reminded that Steven has been focusing on the pop side of his sound, and that really does come through here.
I think the only place I would disagree with your assessment of not that none of these songs could really fit on any previous Porcupine Tree albums is actually Herd Culling, which I feel is like 4 songs off of Dead Wing just cobbled together it feels very Halo. The repeated refrain in the second half of The Wolf is at the Door somehow, the culling of the herd is now feels, and really just the whole second half of the song feels so much like the closing portions of Mellotron Scratch in the way that it makes me feel listening to it. And that is, it's just like massaging such a particular point of my brain that only this band
Barbieri sits on that song.
Yeah.
Oh.
Ever gets at. Yeah, and another great moment that also really feeds into mine, Jake's hypothesis that Richard Barbieri is kind of the MVP of this album, is that I can't remember exactly where in the song it is, but it's in Harridan, where it's basically just Barbieri and Harrison is playing like this fucking unbelievable groove that, like, I don't even know, I can't even begin to count, and it's just like the most audibly unnerved and frantic moment on the album. Like, if you feel like it's going to come apart at the seams at any given minute, and it's like the album is just has so many moments like that it feels, again, it's that urgency that we keep talking about, but it's also not just musical urgency, it's tonal, and has to do with the form and content of the album itself in a very textual sense.
The atmosphere it creates is, I think, one of the biggest draws, is that like all of this fullness and instrumental variety here just makes these songs feel tangible, real, and they sort of reflect the emotional complexity of the lyricism. And also, but you still walk away from it knowing like exactly how each part of it makes you feel, save for the closer, which I think is one of the most complex emotionally songs I think the band have ever made, frankly. But a lot of the tone here and a lot of the feeling I get just imbues me with a sense of both like paranoia and simultaneous catharsis, which, you know, you get on albums like Deadwing, you get on albums like Fear of a Blank Planet, but there's so much, like, I love for example, maybe the storytelling on a song like Dignity, which tells the story of a runaway child who, on that like little journey, I listened to one of the listening parties they did, that the band said, or I think explicitly Steven said, was like someone who in another life would have been like the CEO of a company, or someone who was like really successful or something, but has this like, you know, this heartbreaking childhood that just causes him to leave and depart and go off on his own to maintain his dignity, which again is a really Geddy Lee kind of sentiment that I think would have been found on something like this. Reminds me of a song that would be on like Permanent Waves, something that's just really stand out and emotionally complicated and has like a really classic sound. And I love that about it.
I was going to say the tone of the songwriting and just the general tone of that song, which is incidentally my second favorite on the record after the opener. It's kind of like the meeting point of Fear of a Blank Planet and like Routine off of Hand Cannot Erase, like this dark and depressing and moody song that also has the sense of like tragedy to it. I just can't get enough of that track.
Steven's solo stuff, I think maybe like that may be the biggest argument I feel for just the way this album sounds, is I just feel like that Steven's solo work informs this a lot, especially Hand Cannot Erase and Insurgents a lot, is that there's the urgency of the lyricism and the emotionality of Hand Cannot Erase, and the sort of modernity of that album, in the sense that it is very much about being alive right now, but in a way that is purely emotional and not about like, you know, current thing. But the sort of overbearingly oppressive atmosphere of something like Insurgents, which I think is really, really evident on the last three songs. Herd Culling, as I said, I think is just fucking sensational. There's just so many moments on this album that, like, I feel like a lot of people associate progressive music, especially with like a reunion album, and they just think of these like really long, really dry, mostly just kind of boring thing. And it's like everything here, even at its longest, is so dynamic and so urgent and so like some of them are just like they're very darkly fun. Like Rat's Return, for example, I think is a really like it's fun with a wicked sense of humor, and that it's just you look at the lyricism to that song, the rats return to take their bow. It's just like, oh shit, this is about dictators. But Chimera's Wreck, I think,
rat again. Oh, rat again.
Steven Wilson concept album about Disney villains. What?
Anyway. I mean, specifically about the Great Mouse Detective, I will pay.
Chimera's Wreck, the closer here. This is one of the most instrumentally complex, evolving, almost structureless songs on here. And boy, howdy, I think my favorite moment from this whole rollout, like I can't stress enough that like, I divorced from the fact that I hate that a lot of how music publications and music critics and stuff talk about progressive music. Getting to enjoy the rollout for a new Porcupine Tree album with my friends has been one of the highlights of my year. It's been so fun getting to experience my favorite band and being reminded why they're my favorite band with a bunch of other people who also love them. It's just something that I think is easily taken for granted, and it's been nice. And I deserved that this year. I deserved the nice thing. But my favorite moment from this rollout is in the DMs when Morgan first listened to this and then just sent the lyrics to this song and went like, Porcupine Tree's back, baby. And then immediately sent that like Wojak image. It's like the guy with like sallow eyes, just like.
Yeah, it was specifically the lyric, I'm afraid to be happy and I couldn't care less if I was to die. I'm like, fuck, Steven, I will walk off this bridge.
Real shit.
It sounds like overbearingly like dour, and it is an album that I do think is full of cathartic moments, like Harridan, like Dignity, like, and even again in some of the songs that revel in the darkness, you can kind of get out of it and just how purely aggressive they are. But I think Chimera's Wreck is an interesting point because it sort of serves as a synecdoche for that sort of like the theme of the album being like, being at a crossroads and being like having your past behind you, your future ahead of you, and you're not really embracing either. And you're just kind of stuck. And it's just like, this is the point on the album where they acknowledge that it's terrifying to move forward. And you sort of get the sense that it's like, if you move forward and you sort of go through a sense of like personal growth or achieve like a modicum of happiness, you almost feel like you don't deserve it. You almost feel, it feels unnatural, especially from like a band so obsessed with like negativity and sadness as Porcupine Tree. It's like embracing what is to come feels weird and different and scary. And that's kind of what this song is about. Like just in general, the Chimera's Wreck is just you being at like, a beast with many heads, as they said in like the listening party. And I just think that in all the ways that this is a reminder of why I love this band and why a lot of fans love this band, is that it manages to mine the most value out of its place in this band's discography. And that aspect of it reminds me the most of Lightbulb Sun, my favorite Porcupine Tree album, which I also think mines the most out of its place in the band's discography, because while you can certainly argue that there are better albums that follow it, even though I'm not one of those people, that there are albums that come after it that you think have more value and stuff, is that I would argue that creative streak that comes after Lightbulb Sun is all occupying the same kind of space as that streak. Whereas Lightbulb Sun is a singular moment of them being on the precipice. And Closure Continuation is that as well. That said, if this turns out to be the last Porcupine Tree album for whatever reason, I'm okay with that. And honestly, I think that's the best accomplishment of the album, is that this feels like it could serve as a definitive endpoint for this band that feels so much more tightly wound and like something the band wanted to go out on more than the incident. It feels like a final, putting the period at the end of the sentence, is that like, if this does end up being the final album from this band, I am more than content with that. If they go on to do stuff and make new music, I am, of course, going to be absolutely thrilled. But if this is it, you guys had a great run. And at the end of the day, you went out on an album that, in my humble opinion, while not as good as the 2000s run, I don't think, really isn't that far off from it. I think I'd say that for me personally, this ranks in the dead middle of the discography, really. And for my favorite band, that's saying a whole lot. That said, we haven't heard from August yet. And I personally would like to.
Yeah. So this album, I didn't really listen to the singles leading up to it because I don't know, that's just me, honestly. I don't like to listen to singles really in isolation before a record's out.
That's understandable.
And so like I know, I guess I just have a certain level of self-control where even if it's a band I am head over heels for, like Porcupine Tree, I can somehow avoid a single that people are just absolutely blowing up over. And I guess before I get into this, I think this is a good album full of good songs. But that's also kind of where I get off with this album, is the thing. I don't think I really love any one song on here. Like when I first listened to Harridan, I was more confused than anything, just that it was the song that people had seemed to be hyping up. And I guess I just, on some level, didn't really get it, because while I do think the really muscular instrumental here is pretty interesting, I find the effects on Wilson's voice just completely deflate a lot of the tension this song had going for it. So I wasn't a fan of it. And then the song got to that second half and I was like, okay, I'm really into the keyboards and Gavin's drumming. And I kind of found that with a lot of this album, I was really into, I at least bare minimum liked the instrumentals. Even a track like The New Day, which feels a little more standard rock ballady, you kind of get into it, and what the song reveals itself as being is it's a little less standard than you think. Like you listen to do the little tapping along, it's like, oh, they're shifting time signatures subtly but gradually throughout the song, and that's a fun detail for me. I really enjoyed that track in particular, the way how it was deceptively simple, if to call back to our previous review. But I guess as I went on, I just found a lot of the songs really didn't click with me, and it was for sort of the reason that I find a lot of the tracks on here, while I think you all have done a beautiful job of talking up what these songs mean to you, to me these tracks just feel a little too vague and ambiguous to really do a lot for me. I think Dignity is the strongest piece of storytelling on here, but it does also feel very Hand Cannot Erase, which and that just kind of, it felt a bit like treading water in that sense of the storytelling on that track. The track that really broke me was Walk the Plank, which is to me the most like ethereal moment on here that just ultimately doesn't amount to doing a whole lot for me. And I guess when you guys
no
talk
guitars
about...
on my Porcupine Tree song, how dare you?
No, but let me get to my point, you fuck. I think it is fair that you guys mentioned this idea of interrogating prog albums less from this mathematical sense and more from an emotional perspective. And I think that's what Porcupine Tree has always done very well as a band. They're very emotionally inflective and pretty. And for me, this just does not evoke really any of the emotions as strongly as a typical Porcupine Tree album does for me. It just felt like a weird kind of half measure to me. I really wasn't getting into it. I listened to this a lot, and not a single moment ever really clicked for me, if I'm totally honest. I like Chimera's Wreck. That's probably my favorite song on here. I kind of wish it wasn't the closer, because I think it's a particularly weak song to end on, especially with the way how it fades out. I think if you tacked on the bonus track Population 3 as that song's kind of instrumental outro would work a little better. So yeah, overall, I think it's a well-structured record. I think it's a well-paced record. I like the way it kind of has a very mirrored parallel structure to it. I think that's a clever, very Steven Wilson way to put an album together. But yeah, this whole thing just, it was like a swing. It was a swing and just a complete miss for me in about every way I didn't want it to be.
Hey, look, you're in the most unenviable position that maybe anyone has ever been on this podcast at any point, which is having to sell, not clicking with a record, but not really like having fundamental reasons why, which is like something we've all experienced, I think. And it's a fucking shitty place to be in.
You know what? This happened to me with fucking Black Midi. I had the exact same experience where I was just like, yep, this works, all this is good. I feel fucking nothing. Not the new Black Midi, for the record, the old ones. Oh
shit, but how do I tell you this? But Schlagenheim's my next record club.
Oh, cool. That'll make for an interesting conversation, actually. I'm glad you picked that.
Will.
Me during the microphones in 2020 segment type beat.
There we go. I mean, it happens, and it sucks that it's a band that you really like too. Like, I get it. That happens. It sucks. But I'm thankful you're so forthright and at least willing to meet this album on a way I think many people aren't. Because again, for as unenviable as a position as you're in, you didn't sit here and explain it to me like it was algebra. So
no, I mean, I'm not gonna be some fucking dick who just picks through, who's like, well, I don't like that Gavin Harrison's taking the lead on this track. This is bad.
Oh my god.
How dare a drummer in Prog do anything? You're supposed to keep the time, you degenerate.
One thing that August pointed out is that there are 3 bonus tracks that were released for this album, and I just want to say I love all 3 of them. Population 3, badass instrumental. Never Have, I think is Never Have and Love in the Past Tense are both really great. I agree with the band's decision to release them as bonus tracks just because as an album I like the tightness and concision of it.
I guess, and the kicker for me is I kind of like some of the bonus tracks more than I like a lot of the songs on the album.
I'm just glad you like some shit.
No, it's like the tried and true experience of like the hardcore fan of a lot of bands is always like, why the fuck was this not on the album?
Yeah, if you're someone who is like, it's worth a shot, Not everyone's gonna have my experience. Not everyone's gonna have Jake, Morgan, or Ryley's experience.
Yes.
Well, I hear and see the palpable sadness in you, so it's all good, man. We'll get somewhere with some other album, but I do think it's also just kind of nice that Porcupine Tree showed a modicum of restraint, and it just goes to show you how careful they are with the construction of their albums, that they released those 3 songs as bonus tracks, just because I feel like any other band would just like, just put them on the album. They're all there. Might as well. So,
all right. Favorite tracks and ratings for the new Porcupine Tree album, Closure Continuation. Let's reverse the order up. I'll go first this time, just for shits and giggles. My 3 favorite tracks on here are Harry Dan, Dignity, and Herd Culling. And I'll say least favorite, again, nothing on this that I don't actually really like, but I actually have a developed a really soft spot for Walk the Plank, so that's not going to be my least favorite pick. I feel like it's kind of maybe a vision of what the future of Porcupine Tree could be if they do decide to evolve their sound. Obviously, I think they would need to substantiate it a little bit more than what you get with that song, but I don't mind it. It's a nice point of contrast. My least favorite
Weird jam band Porcupine Tree sounds dope as fuck. So
yeah. Also, like that's one of the moments where like the Barbieri really takes center stage on the album, which is always a real treat. My least favorite is going to be Rat's Return, and I'm going to give this an 8 out of 10.
I will say my 3 favorites. I think Chimera's Wreck is like a top 10, maybe top 5 Porcupine Tree song ever. Like, I love the Raven that refused to sing.
Yeah, that's another album that this really reminded me of.
Least favorite, I don't really have any controversial. It's Walk the Plank, but it goes. So, this is a 9.
Favorites here are going to be Chimera's Wreck. I like
Satellite
of the New Day and Dignity. Least favorite is Walk the Plank. I have no such soft spot for it, like the one on the back of an infant's head. 6 out of 10.
My 3 favorite tracks on here. I'm gonna go with Of the New Day, which I think about that similarly to how Morgan thinks about Chimera's Wreck. I'm gonna say Of the New Day, I'm gonna say Dignity, and I'm gonna say Harridan. And at least favorites Walk the Plank, but I think that song's dope as hell. It serves as a really good interstitial moment. And I give it a 9 out of 10. What a pretty sensational release from the band. If you're all wondering if you've seen my ranking video, I would put it below The Sky Moves Sideways, but above Stupid Dream and Signify. So,
this is like if this album's like if Stupid Dream was Great Dream.
Why is everybody so signified? Signified. Why is everybody so signified?
All right. That means that overall, Porcupine Tree's new album gets an 8.0 from the Jams and Tea podcast. Go and check it out. And that brings us to the end of this episode. Please let us know at home what you think of either of the records we've discussed today, Porcupine Tree's Closure Continuation or Regina Spektor's Home Before and After. We want to hear from you in the comments below. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple, you can head on over to the YouTube link in the description and leave us a comment via that platform. We really appreciate any comments that you feel like leaving. It really helps us our engagement. And also like, it's cool to hear what people think as well, especially if you think differently to any of us, or maybe you agree with us. Either way, hit us up. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like. That helps us a lot too. Subscribe to the channel if you have not done that already. If you want to go above and beyond and support us even more, you can hit the join button on our YouTube page. And for just $1 a month, you can support the channel directly, get your name featured in the title call of every video on this channel, get cool emojis of our faces to use in the comments. And if you want to recommend us a record to listen to, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. Until next time, folks.
Rock over London. Rock on Chicago. Lego. Only the best is good enough.